The next speaker is Peter Dupen, who's also been briefed by the EDA on behalf of the POWA. Mr. Dupen.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'd like to pay my respect to the Gundungurra people from whose ancestral and unceded lands I speak from. I respectfully submit to the Commissioners that they should reject this proposal on the grounds that it is not ready for a final determination. Key information has not been provided to enable the Commissioners to make a sound and properly informed decision. My name is Peter Dupen. My qualifications to provide this advice include that I am a senior hydrogeologist now researching methods of improving environmental impact and decision making with better analytical approaches and engagement in a PhD supported in part by DPI. I have over 30 years experience as an environmental regulator and consultant, importantly including 5 years as the mining manager for Water New South Wales up until 2019. During this period, my team and I examined underground mining, particularly Dendrobium mine, impacts on catchments in greater depth than anyone else in Australia. I have been instructed by the EDO on behalf of the Protect Our Water Alliance to provide independent and professional advice as an expert witness and not to advocate for or against a proposal. I take this instruction seriously and have considered the proposal in depth, and my professional advice is that this proposal should not be in front of the Commissioners without key information gaps identified by the IEPMC having been addressed. Not all of these unfulfilled recommendations are deal breakers, but there are 3 that, in my opinion, really are. So just to give some context where that conclusion comes from, the government represented by DPI received final reports from the IEPMC in October 2019. These reports contained a range of observations about the unanticipated extent of impacts that are now understood at Dendrobium and Metropolitan mines and made 50 recommendations. Minister Stokes commendably responded on behalf of the New South Wales Government in April this year to say that we've accepted all of the recommendations from the panel and have established an interagency task force to implement a detailed action plan throughout this year. 8 months later, the government has formed the Independent Advisory Panel for Underground Mining using questionable selection practices, but appears to have stalled on all of the other recommendations made by the panel. In my opinion, DPI should not have progressed this proposal until the most central issues identified by the panel have been answered as Minister Stokes suggested they would. The key questions that I suggest are essential here is 1, what is government's definition of an unacceptable volumetric loss from Sydney's water supply due to mining? 2, if the precautionary principle is to be applied, how narrow do the longwalls need to be in order to maintain 200 vertical metres of unfractured rock between the upper and lower fracture zones? And 3, what is an appropriate level of compensation given the likely permanence of the existing and future catchment losses? And how can it possibly be as low as is currently being proposed? The answer to all these questions are available and/or could and should have been determined in a transparent and credible manner before DPI passed the ball to IPC for final determination. It is disturbingly clear from the submissions to date from the company and key agencies that these data gaps are not being addressed by the government, or if they are, then it is being done behind large locked doors. Further, key information is inexplicably not being made available to the Commissioners to help them make this critically important and momentous decision. I'll use the remainder of my time to explain why I view these as fundamentally important questions and to offer some advice about how they could have been readily addressed by now. So the first issue is about the water supply impacts exceeding predictions and yet remaining negligible. So Dendrobium's experts promised in their 2000 EIS essentially that we'll take the coal, you'll keep your water. The planning approval consequently awarded included a condition that Dendrobium have a no more than negligible impact on Sydney's water supply. The past 5 years has been tumultuous in advancing our understanding of mining impacts in the special area catchments. Beginning with the detailed evidence provided by Peter Turner to Minister Stokes and the Minister's brave decision to require further investigations, which led first to the PSM report in 2017 and subsequently to the formation of the IEPMC in 2018. Thanks to these and other workers, we now know the true extent of fracturing and consequent impacts on the special area catchments and storages. I understand that Commissioners are aware of these impacts, which have been discussed at great length over the past 2 days, and there's some more coming. Although I remain concerned about all the impacts, I will focus this presentation on the volumetric losses from Sydney's drinking water supply. Following the past 5 years of intensive scrutiny by myself and others, current surface water loss estimates range from 2 to 6.5 gigalitres per year, increasing by yet another 3.5 gigalitres per year if the Dendrobium extension is approved. To date, there has never been a quantitative definition of negligible water losses, rendering DPI's existing planning condition unenforceable. I note that no improvement is proposed in DPI's draft conditions for areas 5 and 6. The most fundamental question before the Commission is, in my opinion, how far can you stretch the term negligible impact in relation to Sydney's water supply? Singing from a remarkably similar hymn book, South 32, IEPMC and DPI have in the past compared the estimated volumetric losses due to Dendrobium mine to evapotranspiration, retail pipe loss and other questionable metrics. I suggest that it's more meaningful to compare the volumetric losses with the proportion of stored waters, or with catchment flows in drought, or with the financial impairments using IPART values. For example, the total cumulative mining impacts on special area catchment volumes to date due to mining that have happened or are still going to happen amount to more than 450 gigalitres using Paul Tometta's volumetric conservation method, developed for but yet to be published by Water New South Wales. If this 450 gigalitres were to be removed at once from the catchments, this would empty all of the undermined dams and all of the creeks. More specifically for Dendrobium, the mine is currently taking around 5 megalitres a day, or 1.8 gigalitres a year from the special area catchments, almost none of which was predicted. Due to the extensive cracking and reduction in regional water tables now strongly connected to the mined coal seams, most of the catchments, swamps and streams overlying the existing mine are now dry. Most of these surface water losses will be permanent. The extension proposal would almost double the quantum of water loss and other impacts. Water New South Wales estimate that Dendrobium will be taking 10 of the 13 megalitres every day of surface water removed from special area catchments due to coal mining, and these are very conservative estimates. The Commission has many worthy considerations in front of it. How are you to balance the many commercial imperatives and difficult transitions if the extension is not approved against Sydney's super precious long-term water supply? A key step in answering this question is to quantify what might reasonably be described as negligible, minor, moderate, major and severe impacts. The good news is that this has already been substantially completed, but as far as I can tell from the submissions to date, this information has not been provided to the Commissioners. Water New South Wales has spent close to $1 million developing the standardised assessment framework for mining in the special areas. This draft framework includes a set of impact severity thresholds on which the mining companies and all relevant state agencies, including DPI, have been consulted about mine-specific and cumulative impacts in terms of water quantity, water quality and ecological consequences. The IEPMC recommended in their final report that these thresholds should be finalised and published. I therefore find it surprising that the framework and thresholds have not been presented prior to or during this final assessment of whether the Dendrobium mine extension impacts may be considered acceptable. I strongly suggest that the draft framework needs to at least be presented to you for inclusion in your deliberations. It would be more appropriate, however, if the IEPMC's recommendations had have been enacted in a timely manner and these thresholds were to have already been openly debated and some consensus found, at least within government, prior to such a pivotal decision being made about the future of Sydney's water supply. Mindful I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'll speak more quickly about the other two fundamental issues on which I feel the Commissioners are not being sufficiently informed to make a sound decision. So the second issue is this issue of maintaining a constrained zone. Based on my experience of mining impacts on catchments, I support Water New South Wales's recommendation that protecting the catchments requires that a constrained zone of unfractured rock between the upper and lower fracture zones needs to be maintained. Given the uncertainties and gradational nature of these two zones, however, I suggest that application of the precautionary principle requires an intention to maintain at least 200 vertical metres to reduce the depletion of surface waters to the loss rates being recorded at, say, the Metropolitan Mine. The question then becomes, how narrow would the longwalls need to be in order to maintain such a buffer? After first poo-pooing it, the IPMC have subsequently confirmed that the most reliable, currently available approximation for estimating the height of fracturing is the Tometto equation from 2013. The panel, however, further suggested in their final report that this height should be more accurately estimated for each new mining domain based on post-mining investigation data. That this readily implemented recommendation to estimate Dendrobium's height of cracking has not been progressed, despite numerous expensive investigations to inform it, is perplexing and makes the Commissioner's task harder than it needs to be. Again, I suggest that the Commissioners should refuse to pass judgment on this proposal until this important information gap is closed. The third question that I want to address here is the appropriate level of compensation for water supply losses due to mining. There are a range of issues on which I question South 32's proposals regarding the adequacy of compensation for the surface water it is planning to remove from Sydney's water supply. If I understand it correctly, no compensation is being proposed for the existing, unpredicted and currently unlicensed surface water take from Sydney's drinking water supply. The volume of water likely to be removed from the supply by the proposed extension, variably estimated between 3.3 and 6 megalitres a day, is likely to be permanent due to the widespread development of surface-to-seam cracking and depressurisation of the regional aquifer. If we conservatively average 3 years in 10 to be drought years as climate change envelops us, using IPART rate values of $2.35 per kilolitre in normal wet years and $3.18 per kilolitre when the dam levels fall below 60%, South 32's predictions of 3.3 gigalitres a catchment year, and South 32's predictions of 3.3 gigalitres a year catchment losses, we're looking at compensation rates of around $8.7 million a year. On this basis, the proposed full compensation of the extension losses of $103 million amounts to only 12 years of compensation, at which time the extension would be only half complete. Bear in mind when considering this compensation question that most of the existing mine will continue to be pumped down to maintain access to areas 5 and 6, and that even when the pumps eventually stop, it is impossible for original surface and groundwater conditions to return to pre-mining levels. I suggest that this issue needs much greater consideration before the Commission accepts South 32's meagre compensation proposal on behalf of the taxpayers of New South Wales, and I am surprised by DPI's ready acceptance and indeed encouragement of it in their submission. In conclusion, despite the extraordinary volume of information and modelling presented in the EIS and subsequent fora, I suggest that there are 3 fundamental information gaps which constrain the IPC unnecessarily from making a sound and fully informed decision about this pivotal proposal. On this basis, I can only recommend that the proposal in its current form should be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for that presentation. Just a question around the calculation of the compensation, that last point that you raised. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the losses while mining is taking place have been calculated. That the more difficult thing is to determine the losses likely post-mining, and I think the modelling has shown that losses might be sustained for up to 170 years post-mining. Those losses presumably diminish over that time, eventually go to nil, and I'm assuming that is on the basis that the mine will be sealed. Is that the correct logic that you think has been applied or needs to be applied?
There's a range of issues here. the idea of sealing the mine is kind of useful in some ways to reduce the amount of water that ultimately is going to want to push back and will actually find its way out the escarpment eventually when groundwater levels do rise. So sealing is part of the answer, but the fact that the actual strata have been so broadly now connected to the much more permeable coal seam, both the mined parts of it and the unmined parts of it, mean that there is essentially now a pipe to the drain at the bottom of the bathtub. And so it's, as I've said, in my opinion, it is pretty much impossible. It will never return to pre-mining levels, and and it's a very big question whether it will even return close to pre-mining levels. There's a lot of different questions involved in that, and I think that I definitely believe that the modelling that's been done to date is very optimistic. I would say 170 years is optimistic to return to something like pre-mining levels. And as I say, I don't believe that it can ever actually return to full pre-mining levels. And with the cracks on the surface, and if the groundwater levels remain depressed, then we keep losing that surface water. I mean, depending on where the groundwater levels obviously ultimately rise to, but it will never be the original.
Thank you for that response. John, do you have questions? Richard?
Yeah. Peter, you can feel free to take this question on notice. I assume you might send in something in writing to the commissioners, but the Independent Advisory Panel for Underground Mining did a report on this project in October this year, and the Independent Expert Scientific Committee did a report in August 2019, both of which, being as neutral as I can, raise concerns in relation to water concerning this project. Are there any matters of a particular note that you think the commissioners should have regard to in either of those reports? As I said, if you want to deal with that in a brief written submission, that's fine. Otherwise, feel free to say something now as well.
Yeah, just quickly, the estimates of loss that have been projected, started only 6 years ago. The mining company was projecting incredibly low losses, and due to all this new information which has come available, we can now see that the losses are much greater than they were saying 6 years ago. But there is, of course, a range of estimates. The methodology that has been used, particularly by Cole Mackey from IEPMC, is very good, but it is all about looking at the response of mine inflows to rainfall and looking at that relationship. That completely ignores all of the other leakages from storages and the longer term losses that don't appear in the mine. So there's a lot of questions which remain in play about the estimate losses. But one of the things that I would say about this work that Paul Tometa has done for Water New South Wales is that it does put an outside envelope in what the losses will be and the rates will be. So it can be calculated pretty accurately, but to date, I don't believe that we've got a totally accurate handle on those numbers, but they are certainly, much better than they were 6 years ago. The amount of argument is much smaller now.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Peter.